Welcome to the Center for American Progress and to our discussion on countering China and doing so with American innovation. I am very pleased to be having this conversation at the start of this event with Senator Jack Reed, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and someone who has been a longtime leader on a variety of national security issues. So Senator Reed, welcome. So glad to have you here.
Thank you, Mara, very much. It's a pleasure to be, and I commend the Center for another innovative and forward-looking seminar. So congratulations.
I appreciate that. And of course, we'll have a panel to follow this discussion as well, and I will discuss that a little bit more as we get closer to it. I wanted to lead off and introduce everyone to this topic by referencing back, Senator Reed, to the comments that you have made in other fora about certainly the threats to the U.S. world order posed by our near-peer competitors, China and Russia, but particularly focusing on the tools and the resources and the alliances that we in the United States should be leading with to take on the challenges that we're facing in this century, and particularly with respect to those near-peer competitors. So just in terms of framing, you have put things out in these terms, and the discussion we'll have, I hope, will further bring that out, because clearly the United States is engaged in a strategic competition with China, and technology, among other items on the economic side. On the economic and security side, technology is a key battlefield to prevail. I know that I feel strongly the United States must recognize the economic side of the challenge as well as the security side. And as you pointed out, America is great at innovation. We have powerful tools in our arsenal. And so very much hoping that we can explore that further in our discussion. And I know that Melanie Hart in the panel she's moderating after us will further dive down on some of those issues. So Senator, I wonder if we could start with getting your sense, your concept for strategic competition with China. How would you view or frame the challenge that we're facing?
Well, I think first, we're operating with an assumption in the 80s, the 90s, et cetera, that globalization and commercialization and the expansion of the Chinese economy would create a middle class, which would create a more civic and civil society. And frankly, the recent events, particularly President Xi's arrival on the scene in 2012, particularly when he essentially took sole control, indicated that direction or that assumption was not playing out, that they were going to an authoritarian capitalism, which is a powerful force. We had a long conflict with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, but they were never really able to get their economy working. They could create technical weapons and sophisticated technologies, but now you have a country that has a powerful economy, a huge internal demand from the large population, together with the sophisticated technology getting more sophisticated. And so we are in a competition. What we sort of took for granted is no longer the case. And the other thing I would point out is that for almost 20 years now, we have been distracted from this competition by our involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq and other operations stemming from 9/11. And in that time, the Chinese have built up their technology, and they built up their military and civilian technologies, and Russia, to a degree, has done the same thing. So we're facing these two near-peer competitors. You know, what we thought was the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 90s was a period of, American sort of Pax Americana, and there would be no competition and everyone would become sort of commercial partners, and that's not the case. So now we have to focus on how do we compete against China. I think we obviously have to do it with partners. We can't do it alone. That requires, as you suggest, much stronger alliances that we can build in the Pacific and worldwide, because these problems affect, and the impact of China is worldwide. So that's one major effort we have to pursue. We also have to think about, and we're giving more thought to our industrial capacity, our technological capacity, our innovative capacity. You know, we're discovering that key parts of our economy, like microelectronics and electronic chips, they're not made in the United States. They're made in other places, and some of those places, could be unfriendly to us, to be polite. So we have to now start thinking really about our industrial base, about how we are competing on the world stage with China for the support for the of countries. All that has to be done, and we're trying to evolve now a Pacific Defense Initiative, which will help our forces there, and also help us kind of sense what resources we're putting in. I think for many, many years, the Pacific was sort of not seen as a critical point of contact, particularly given the post 9/11, and now it is. So all these things have to be done.
Thanks, Senator. Very helpful in understanding the context that we are in here. I know that where I want to try to get us to here is where we want to come out of this, what the outcome should be, and to do that, I want to first give a little bit of context, and I want to apologize to our audience. I think we may have some technological problems being worked out currently with the panel that's following, which is hopefully we've got it worked out now. But Sandra, I know, and among other areas, you've played a lead role in pushing forward the American Labor, Economic Competitiveness, Alliances, Democracy and Security Act, the America Leads Act. And I'm definitely going to ask you about that, though not right now. Before I do, I wanted to get your take at a more macro level. What should the end goals for the United States be? How do we best position the United States for success, and what, in your mind, does that success look like?
Well, our end goal is obviously to deter any type of conflict in Pacific and hopefully worldwide. That means that we have to be prepared. We have to have the capabilities and the forces in place, and that's one challenge we face. We also are competing with China in terms of economic rivalry as they expand their Belt and Road policy, as they are engaged in behavior. Some of it's rather sordid behavior in terms of trying to acquire influence. We have to have a much more robust foreign policy, more resource foreign policy, and we also, as I said, have to do it within the context of allies. And we have, particularly in the Pacific, traditional allies like Australia and Japan and South Korea. We have to pull those together, both in a sort of political, diplomatic sense, but also in an operational sense in terms of our military operations. So that's something we can do, and I think it all goes to making the Chinese think twice about doing something dangerous in the Pacific that would invite retaliation and conflict. And then for our own economic prosperity, we have to be able to produce the products and sell the products worldwide. That might require, particularly in some of these highly technical areas, not just traditional, government R&D, but also thinking about some select areas where we're actually helping subsidize production of products located in the United States or elsewhere. We do that on a limited basis with the Jones Act and things like that, but thinking more strategically about what are the key elements. And then we have to go ahead and make sure that our industrial base is not being infiltrated illicitly or explicitly by acquisition by other countries, particularly Chinese. They're very aggressive in terms of doing these things. So we have a whole range of challenges, but the key is to maintain that what has been an international order in the Pacific, which allows free transport, which allows a peaceful global economy and societies to exist, and that's what we want.
Thanks. It does sound like the economic and security challenges and the economic and security solutions are very much interlaced in how we're dealing with this, or how we ought to be dealing with it. There does seem to be broad agreement among progressives that the United States should seek to work with allies and partners on China instead of standing alone, as seems to be the case currently. That we, the United States, seem to be more isolated than our near peer competitors on some of these key issues. How do you think, Senator, that the United States can best cooperate with alliances and leverage the alliance structures we have at this point to compete on issues like the Belt and Road Initiative you talked about, China's aggressive assistance programs and non-traditional security threats?
Well, I think one obvious thing is the president should go and enthusiastically talk about our participation in NATO, our strongest and perhaps oldest alliance, and also one that has been with us in Afghanistan, so it has a broader reach than just Europe. And then I think we have to be very forward-leaning in terms of enlisting our allies in the Pacific. Australia has been a key ally, Japan, obviously, South Korea, and even, making serious approaches towards the Philippines to see if we can establish a relationship. Very difficult with Duterte as the president, but it's something that we have to do. And I think the other factor too is we have to once again understand the value and the limitations of international organizations. I mean, as Dr. Hart points out in her paper, the Chinese have really infiltrated the standard-setting organization for 5G, and as a result, we're sort of voiceless in some respects. We've got to recognize that we have to participate in these international organizations in order to be influential, and do so not just alone, but with the weight of our strong allies, the G7 allies in particular. And those are some of the things that I think we have to do to kind of organize ourselves for this confrontation. If we're alone vis-a-vis China, our chances of success are much less than if we are united with other countries with similar ideals and aspirations of the United States.
Thanks, Senator. I wonder if the flip side of the question of who we need to ally with and how we maximize our alliance structures and opportunities is the question of whether we in the United States need to look at some degree of decoupling with China. And if so, what does that look like for us and for the rest of the world?
Well, we have over the last 30 plus years integrated the economies of the world in a significant way. In fact, I think we discovered with the COVID virus how, equipment we thought was being produced in Iowa, actually many of the parts came from China, et cetera. So we've understand over the last several months, if we didn't already, this is a very interconnected world economy. It's going to be difficult to decouple, but I think the first thing we want to do is identify those critical elements for our national security, critical products. Then just see what our supply chain looks like. How much of it is exposed? Is there alternate supplies in countries that we have very good relationships with and traditional relationships with? So that analysis is sort of the first step. And I think after that analysis, we can make some better decisions about what kind of enterprises that we support? What type of products do we think we absolutely need? We can't essentially trust to this global world economy. And in that sense, there will be a beginning of a decoupling. I don't think it's going to be abrupt. And I think the other thing we want to do too is try to get into all the markets, including China. But the Chinese are very much resistant to that, even though we're open. And I think, again, with the combination of powerful allies, we'll have more influence on getting into the Chinese market and their behavior than alone. So those are some of the things I think we have to do. Is it a decoupling? Yes, but it's a gradual, calculated, and we hope strategic one, not simply we're going to put a ban on all products coming out of China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks. Well, I think that my next question follows from that. If we're looking at a particular area of products or services, and which would be a very general way of talking about work in the technology sector and specifically 5G issues.
Right.
Can you lead us through a little bit what the National Defense Authorization Act, which I know obviously your baby, and the America Leads Act, what they do, how they address some of these 5G issues that seem to me so critical for how the United States positions itself?
Well, we recognize that 5G is critical, that if Huawei, for example, is dominating the world, there is the potential, if not the reality, that they can use that leverage adversely against us in terms of, backdooring equipment and extracting information, cutting information off at a critical moment where it's needed. So we do understand the strategic challenges. And what we've tried to do in the NDAA is, first of all, tell the military to go ahead and set up 5G facilities on numerous bases so that we can have the experience of establishing 5G networks, and they are moving forward on that. And the other thing we're doing, which is very similar to the excellent paper that Dr. Hart and our colleagues put together, is to ask them to use the open radio access network approach. One of the great insights from the paper was that the present system is hardware linked. If you don't have, you have to have the same hardware from the same company to make the system work, and Huawei has exploited that. But if we can start using not hardware but software to integrate systems, to then we can break, we hope, their monopoly. And so the use of this O-RAN and vRAN, which is a virtualization random radio access network, using this and letting the military experiment with it and to deploy it will give us, we think, an advantage that we can help broadly speaking. But one of the solutions to the technological solutions is getting away from a hardware-based system to a much more flexible software-based system where you can interconnect different pieces of hardware through the software. And that's where I think we have to go. And we're doing a lot, not just in terms of asking them to put these networks together, but research and analysis at DARPA and other places, which could be critical for our commercial as well as our military.
Well, thanks. I could not have asked for a better lead-in to Dr. Hart's panel, and really appreciate both that, Senator Reid, your participation with us today, and your strong leadership on so many issues, and particularly the critical ones that we've been talking about today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mara, very much. And again, congratulations to the Center for taking the lead on an issue that's critical to the United States and to the world. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. With that, I want to introduce the second part of today's session, which is led by Dr. Melanie Hart, about whom you've already heard a fair amount. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Hart as the director of our China program at the Center for American Progress. And she has also co-authored a thorough and fascinating report that Senator Reid referenced as well today. That report has just been released, is publicly available, and that offers a number of practical solutions to the Huawei challenge and to many of the issues that we have been discussing, and that Melanie is going to lead a panel through a discussion on next. So Melanie, thank you for all of your work, and over to you.
Thanks, Mara. And that was a great introduction. Thanks to Mara and to Senator Reid in particular for sharing the broad framework of the China challenge and how the U.S. Congress is really taking a lead on positioning the U.S. for success. And for the next panel, we're going to dive into the weeds a bit and tease out how specifically what are some of the 5G challenges that the U.S. faces, and how is it that we actually have great opportunities to lead in this sector. Senator Reid mentioned that the supply chain is a big concern, and if our audience takes away one message, we would like that message to be, yes, Virginia, we do have American companies who are leading in 5G. This is a game we can play in and a game that we can lead in as well. And we'll talk about that, a lot of that today. So I have a great group of panelists joining us. I'll introduce them and hopefully they'll turn their cameras on and join us as we go through the introductions. The first is John Baker. He's the Senior VP of Business Development at Mavenir. He leads the 5G team at Mavenir, where he's at the forefront of the company's drive to change operator views on wireless infrastructure deployment and promote the software-defined approach to innovation in 5G that Senator Reid was mentioning. Mavenir is based in Richardson, Texas, but it has a global presence. And before joining Mavenir, John Baker held senior positions with a range of wireless companies. He has deep expertise in the sector. Second, we have Lindsay Gorman. She's a fellow for emerging technologies at the German Marshall Fund, U.S. Alliance for Securing Democracy. Before joining GMF, she ran a technology consulting firm focusing on AI and fintech. She has also worked at the office of U.S. Senator Mark Warner, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the National Academy of Sciences. And I personally really respect her deep technical expertise and also her understanding of what China is doing. And she wrote a great article recently for Lawfare on some of what Senator Reid mentioned about what China is doing in the standardization forums to push Huawei's technology over the competitors. Third, we have John Mezzalingua. He's the CEO and chairman of JMA Wireless. He founded JMA in 2012 in Syracuse, New York. JMA designs and manufactures 4G and 5G products, and it has pioneered a fully virtualized RAN for carrier and private networks. JMA recently announced plans to develop an advanced 5G manufacturing campus in downtown Syracuse, which will span a city block and open in mid-2021. And last but not least, we have Steve Papa. He's the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Parallel Wireless. Parallel Wireless is based in Nashua, New Hampshire. They provide software-defined, cloud-based mobile network systems, currently in 2G, 3G, and 4G, and I think they're getting ready to do some 5G systems as well. And Steve leads the senior management team there and has really deep telecom expertise and a long history working in this sector. And to start, we'll start by talking about what exactly is Beijing up to? Why does Huawei have such a dominant global position? Why is this such an intractable challenge? And then we'll talk more about what American firms can do to really help us address the challenge. But first, to Lindsay, one thing that that bothers me in 5G discussions is that a lot of US observers just assume that Huawei is this super competitor, that they have a lot of natural advantages that led to their current market position. But whereas what we found in the CAP research is that Beijing has been there every step of the way, providing subsidies, providing loans. My co-author in the CAP report, Jordan Link, tracked 99 loans that Chinese state banks provide to Huawei's customers around the world, often at very low interest rates and very generous terms. There's a lot of intervention in standardization organizations to push Huawei technology. They are not in this game alone. They have the deep resources of the Chinese state. So to start us off, Lindsay, what are you seeing? How is Beijing tilting the playing field in Huawei's favor? What do we need to understand about that in order to get U.S. policy right?
Thank you, Melanie, for the invitation to speak here, and thank you to CAP. I'm really looking forward to engaging with you and also this amazing suite of practitioners on the panel this afternoon. To sort of put your question, I think, in perspective, I would absolutely agree with you that Huawei has certainly had help from Beijing on a number of levels, and really appreciate the work that you've done in this new report, really drilling down on some of the details of how those subsidies are really furthering Huawei, not just within China, but actually across the Belt and Road Initiative countries, where I think a lot of the governance impacts of Chinese technology that, ultimately is what I think from a US and democratic values perspective that we're really concerned about. That's where I think a lot of this governance is playing out, and you can see it through those loans. I'd definitely like to talk a little bit about the standard setting bodies and sort of how this top-down approach that Beijing has taken and really cross-societal approach has helped advantage Huawei and other companies as well, like ZTE in particular, that are setting kind of the rules of the road, not just for the 5G infrastructure technology, but really the full spectrum of the application layer technologies that are going to sit atop 5G. And I think there's a tension and perhaps sometimes a misperception on 5G, because it's easy to see this as just sort of the pipes and just sort of the infrastructure, and perhaps harder to imagine why it's so important beyond solely an espionage case, which I think has been prosecuted actually quite effectively around the world, for why Chinese dominance of this infrastructure technology is so important to contest. And that's really because the advantages that being on the ground floor, literally, of the infrastructure layer are going to have in the applications, and how the applications of this sort of entire ecosystem of the future internet are going to shape the governance norms and this contest that Senator Reid alluded to between democracies and autocracies and unfolding over the information space. So in particular regard to the standards bodies, I think what we've seen is Beijing has taken this top-down approach, whereby in addition to Made in China 2025, they put forward a China Standards 2035 initiative that really brings across society the effort to export domestic standards at international bodies that historically have been primarily technocratic, primarily from the Western perspective, industry driven, and not subject to really state control. And I think what the US and its allies really need to reckon with going forward is, in the face of this type of block level coordination from Beijing that is deliberately designed to advantage those standards that and the standards that go into these technical patents and then end up paying royalties later on to companies like Huawei and ZTE. If we're not going with that top-down approach, and I think there's room for debate about how much we might need to wade into that, then how do we make sure that US and allied companies remain competitive in these bodies? And so these in particular, we've seen the International Telecommunications Union has been a particular locus of Beijing's influence. Back during the latter half of 2016, something I referenced in the Lawfare article, there was kind of this I would say watershed moment of realization, I think, of the importance of these bodies when there was a debate over one particular element of the 5G standard as it was being developed, the so-called polar codes, and a system for encoding data into this 5G standard. So it's very technical stuff that's being meted out, but essentially Beijing promoted a block action, and amongst a number of different options, when Lenovo initially had voted for the non-Huawei option, there was sort of a public outcry back in China against, and a backlash against what was considered an unpatriotic vote. And so then when they considered the coding technology for the second part of the standard a few months later, Lenovo had switched its vote, and this was a cause of celebration that Huawei had been able to include its own polar coating solution into the standard. And I think, in this particular case, it's less important that we went with a polar coating technology as opposed to some of the other technologies, low density parity check that were being implemented, but more that the more Huawei and Chinese companies are able to insert their own technology into these standards in this coordinated fashion that heretofore the United States has not really doubled down on, they are increasing in competitiveness. And I think, secondly on this point, I would say that the efforts that China is using to shape the rest of the United Nations to shape human rights in favor of economic liberty economic development, as opposed to personal liberty, we're also seeing those initiatives play out in the future internet and technology sphere that 5G really underlies. And so we're talking about standards like with smart streetlights that have data storage built in that can pipe right back to a central authority, predictive policing that put forward very futuristic Minority Report style anticipatory action as part of smart city and safe city technology. And so I think this top-down coordinated approach really marries competitiveness with values in a way that should be very disconcerting for democracies, and in one in which we have not, at least yet, developed a coordinated approach that both advances our values and our technology at the same time through these standards.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful to set up the challenge. One thing that seems to be that has perhaps held back some U.S. policymakers on addressing the challenge is what seems to be a pervasive misconception that we don't have great American companies that can go out and compete with Huawei. But Senator Reid mentioned that there are virtualized approaches to 5G or software approaches to 5G where American companies, including the three represented here, are in the lead and could really potentially give Huawei a run for its money. So John Mezzalingua, if I could turn to you, could you explain for our CAP audience what is vRAN? Why is it so revolutionary? Why is it important? And how is it that that is potentially a major advantage for American companies in global competition?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Melanie. And thank you for your leadership on this position. When we spoke a few weeks ago, I was impressed with the depth that you had and all of the issues that we in the industry have been seeing for years. So it's at the right time. Let me start by explaining what a RAN is. It's for the non-engineers in the audience. It's a radio access network, which is really the critical network element that connects wireless to the user. So the traditional solution is custom hardware. So it's single sourced, it's proprietary to that single supplier, it's expensive, and it's hard to upgrade. And it's the key reason that a closed network, a closed system exists in these wireless networks. And I think the principal reason why the senator spoke about software being able to unbundle and break everything apart. So when it comes to virtual RAN or vRAN, that fundamentally converts that custom RAN functionality from hardware to software so that you can run it on any standard computer server. So the best example that I can share with you of this in practice is in a stadium where you have 80,000 spectators who use their devices super intensely, and you have to wire up that stadium specifically to handle all the bandwidth. And what happens is you bring all the equipment together in a room that houses the traditional RAN equipment, and it's all customized to that supplier. And we have this unique vRAN product that we call XRAN. It requires no specialized hardware to run it, just software, and just the hardware, the custom hardware that it runs on, or the server that it runs on. But there's no custom hardware associated with our product. It's purely software. So the example that we use in the stadium is this XRAN is actually installed in a stadium in Rome, Italy. It's this Stadium Olimpico. And this room was filled with Chinese equipment, ZTE in this case, that was completely replaced by a simple Dell server running our software in the corner of the room. It was just a simple rack. And This is the power of what virtual RAN is. This is how you compete with the Chinese. You do it through innovation. And this is not something that's brand new. This has been on the market and in that stadium for now 2 years and 2 months. And because we control all the software, we don't depend on anyone else. So just like the large traditional guys like Samsung and Ericsson and Nokia, we control our own destiny on this. All the building blocks associated with the hardware and the ultimate product. So the message here is that it's American owned and it can be done. It's the war against the Chinese is not lost, and that's a pretty vivid example of this, Melanie. So.
Thank you. And so, it's an important point when you mentioned that a room full of hardware can be replaced by one device. Even if Huawei has a lot of Chinese government subsidies and they can make a room full of hardware more cheaply than we can, if you replace it with one small piece of hardware packaged with software, that seems like a natural cost advantage that gives the US perhaps a new angle to compete in these global markets without trying to do what China's doing, but rather innovating and doing something totally new. So another topic that we should cover is interoperability. Senator Reid mentioned that DoD and the NDAA are really really breaking ground and using US military facilities to help new companies in the United States experiment with interoperable and vRAN solutions. There are still some challenges on interoperability and what that means in the standardization realm and what firms like yours need to be able to really compete in this market. John Baker, can you share with us what is the interoperability issue? Why is it so important and a prerequisite really to break down the market barriers, to get rid of the Huawei monopoly and really allow more competition and the kind of innovative solutions that we're talking about here?
Sure. Thanks, Melanie, and thanks for the opportunity to put the case for open standards and open RAN as we go forward. This is sort of a historical problem that started probably 5-10 years ago, where standards bodies, were sort of really becoming under the control of the major OEMs, and I sort of put that as sort of the 4 major players like ZTE, Huawei, Nokia, and Ericsson, and to the extent that where it started back in, with 2G, standards were meant to define interfaces, define protocols so that, products could be interoperable from multiple suppliers and create an ecosystem of multiple suppliers. But what's happened over time as these standard bodies have been, fairly tightly controlled, that the standards have become actually frameworks where, they would define a framework for products to be interoperable, but actually the content of the framework has been left open to the actual vendor themselves. So you've ended up with a scenario that the vendors actually, put their own protocols in there, products won't interwork, and this is what's led to the whole market situation where you have to buy a complete radio network from one vendor to ensure that everything is functioning properly. And this has resulted over time as the industry has consolidated to really essentially 3 major players now. That as you take out the Chinese companies from playing in those marketplaces, you're left with a duopoly. And it's very hard for vendors to sort of break into those marketplaces, let alone break into China and other places. So what we've been proposing really now is to move to open and interoperable standards where essentially the standards bodies should actually fill in all the detail. And this is really what's been happening over the last 4 years through the ORAN Alliance that has pulled together probably 140 companies now to really fix the problems that have been generated in the overarching 3GPP specifications. 3GPP has really become the place where the work programs have been laid out. Certainly, Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei have sort of been in the controlling positions of those standards bodies. But to the extent that, you know, there's so much work that gets done that, you know, you could argue the specification doesn't get completed. But, you know, as we see with ORAN specifically, you know, people are willing to do this work. So in a sense, the standard bodies are now being supplemented by ORAN, ONF, and a lot of US companies helping in that. So they're filling in the gaps. But now really what's needed is sort of the overarching policy around standards that, you know, standards that get produced should be open and interoperable. And then, you know, this will allow the growth of the ecosystem. You know, clearly we've seen that Huawei has been very much against Open RAN and really blocking, you know, from their perspective, they're not going to allow, you know, they've said they're not going to believe in it at this point. But, you know, if we can get these interfaces open, and I think the industry is coalescing and moving in that direction, then, you know, it breaks open the ability for other vendors to grow into that space. And, you know, to your point, the fact that, you know, when you get underneath the next layer of the supply chain for 4G, 5G networks, there are actually a lot of those are US companies. And, you know, as we move to this disaggregated network architecture, if you like, you know, through open interfaces, then, you know, you end up with a network of disaggregated suppliers, and, you know, that's where we can all then compete on a global basis. And this has real impacts, you know, not only for the US, but a global market, that, you know, these disaggregated suppliers can compete on an equal playing field to stimulate, you know, 5G, and there's now discussions even started on 6G. So, you know, we need to get this straight as fast as possible, and bring that guiding policy, if you like, that open interfaces, but making sure they're fully interoperable so that two different manufacturers can pick up those specifications and build product that will compete.
Thank you. So basically, you know, the traditional model would be one in which, if I'm, correct me if I'm wrong in this simplification, but the traditional model would be one in which a new upstart company with a bright idea couldn't enter the market to start making their own 5G system without spending a lot of money on core components from another dominant firm. But if it is interoperable, yes, then there are opportunities to plug and play in small ways and big ways without that big barrier on the front end.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think, you know, you see this as going back right into the, you know, investment companies, you know, the lack of venture investment, if you like, in the telecommunication space is because, you know, historically, if you can't sell through Nokia and Ericsson and Huawei, there is actually no way to sell your product into that market. So, you know, by opening these interfaces, you bring everybody onto a level playing field, and, you know, system integrators, operators can then pick from the best supplier to move forward, you know, whether it be hardware or software. But, you know, and software is now, you know, obviously becoming the dominant choice of building these networks. You know, Mavenir has been supplying virtualized networks for the last 15 years in their component form. And to that extent, you know, we see far more growth coming from the software side now as these interfaces get open. So there'll be a lot more competition, and, you know, operators will get best of breed, you know, from a technology and a price perspective.
Thank you. So Steve, moving to you. You know, I know Parallel Wireless is selling and deploying these software-based systems around the world. I know you're doing some great stuff in 2G and 3G and 4G. What are you seeing as you seek to export this new approach? Where are you seeing market barriers come into play? Where do you see Huawei and the China putting their thumb on the scale of the global market? What are the kinds of barriers you're facing that we want to try to address from a policy standpoint going forward?
Well, I'm happy to be here and happy to talk through what we're seeing globally, because we, you know, while we do stuff domestically, we have one of the largest ORAN networks in the US, actually in the Pacific Northwest. We do a lot in Africa and developing markets. As you'd imagine, if ORAN promises a more economical way to serve the customers, okay, you'd expect those with the most challenging economics to be the early adopters. This is what we saw when Intel computers showed up in the data center. I was there at the beginning, and our early customers were retailers in the Philippines, places like that, right, where they couldn't afford the more expensive equipment. So tons of demand. And we have to remember, in many of these countries, there's still perhaps less than a third of the phones can even make phone calls natively on a 4G network. There's just an installed base of users that need to be on, the earlier Gs. So a great example is MTN. They're the largest wireless operator across Africa in many countries. They want to deploy 5,000 sites that are all G sites, software upgradable to 5G, all that kind of stuff. But they need financing. Okay, this is new coverage. And for them, they have cities of millions of people with inadequate coverage. Okay, this is not where I live in New Hampshire in the middle of nowhere. This is, millions and millions of people. But Huawei shows up and offers turnkey financing for every part of the system. And that includes digging the ditches, pouring the cement, putting up fences, putting up the steel, importing the steel, you name it. Okay. And so we have an opportunity to provide 5,000 sites if we can provide comparable financing. That's literally the challenge presented to us. And then we try to look at the tools presented to us, such as XM and whatnot, but they focus on the electronics. Turns out the electronics is a relatively small portion of the system. Okay, there's a lot of content that's just local in these countries. Okay, and China, because they look at it as part of Belt and Road, they have no problem subsidizing that. We don't have a comparable view to export financing that the Chinese do, right? So that's one big place. The second big place is the scaled supply chains that Huawei enjoys. So Huawei is the world's largest antenna manufacturer, the world's largest radio head manufacturer. That gives them cost advantages that take time for us to catch up, right? So we have very little margin to work with, right, to do this very complex thing, and that compounds it further, okay? And then I would say one other bit of that hasn't come up, but when China gets to stipulate local content in their own equipment, so first of all, they get to stipulate that you have to use Chinese gear in Chinese networks, right? Turns out the Chinese wireless networks are a third of the global demand. So if they just have that gives them enormous scale advantages, right, for the manufactured product. Then when you look at things like semiconductors that go in there as part of China 2025, right, and they have inbuilt massive R&D budgets from that scale, that makes it even more challenging for Western companies to participate.
Thank you. And go back to Lindsay. Lindsay, when you're listening to, we have here represented 3 great American companies that are making 5G solutions with American workers, with American manufacturing, with American innovation, and making a lot of great progress, also encountering some challenges with both the legacy system and the China challenge. As we start to shift our conversation to what to do about it, what's your immediate reactions to what we've heard from these 3 gentlemen?
Yeah, thanks. I think, to Steve's last point, I would say that I think, look, it's amazing that we absolutely need to be incentivizing more U.S. innovation here. And in particular, I think as we shift, as the technology itself moves more in a direction of software-defined networks and away from legacy hardware, the U.S. actually will have a natural advantage here. I mean, the United States generally is considered to be stronger than China in software development and deployment. So I think we will be able to capitalize on that. But to Steve's point, I'm of the belief that virtualized networks alone are not going to be the solution to the 5G race. I think they're a very important component of this toolkit, but some of these market subsidies and coordinated actions and writing Chinese technology into Belt and Road Initiative, MOU agreements, are things on a policy level and a political level, and particularly on a diplomatic level, that the United States is also going to have to reckon with if we want our technology to succeed in making it into these global standards, not just for our own networks, but increasingly in the developing world. And I mean, I'm really encouraged to hear that some of these companies are operating in tight market conditions, because I think that's one of the the big challenges that we faced. I went on a delegation trip to Brazil back in the before times, and to raise sort of the awareness of some of these national security issues around 5G. And a big part of the struggle, I think, that an economy, even a medium-sized economy like Brazil has, is that much of the country is underserved, and trying to make a financial case, an economic case, or a national security case almost against economic interests is really difficult. So I think we absolutely need to be coming up with these cheaper solutions, and I think we will be well placed to do that. Having said that, countries are making decisions on these RAN vendors right now in real time, and they are going with the oligopoly, Ericsson, Nokia, when they're moving away from Huawei. And I think I think a point that John made about Huawei's own kind of reluctance to embrace the more interoperable networks. I think we saw, perhaps a year ago, that was kind of the rumblings coming from Ericsson and Nokia, but now they have actually also, and I think will continue to move to embrace these types of networks. And so I wonder whether we might down the road see if this technology does become more mainstream and really the forefront of innovation, will we see Huawei and ZTE move to embrace open networks as well and compete in that space? And if that's the case, I do think, as I said, the US will have some advantages, but that some of these more structural components and advantages that Beijing, through its top-down economy and industrial policy, has been able to hammer out in the 5G case already, might also play out further down the road in 6G and in some of the later deployments of 5G, where I hope we'll see some of these standards and open networks. Sort of also to the point I think you raised originally, Melanie, about this idea that there are no American competitors and no great American companies. And I'm happy that we're starting to dispel this claim, but I would also love to provide a little bit of context in the diplomatic and political environment, sort of how this line came about, and where it's helpful and where it's less helpful. And so I think we can take it back almost 2 years ago, when the Trump administration began to start prosecuting this case among U.S. allies, that Huawei and ZTE, but more to the extent Huawei, should not be present in allied 5G networks. And this is primarily played out on the continent in Europe, but has derived support and engagement from allies and partners across the Five Eyes in Australia and Canada and other places as well. And they sort of drove this diplomatic engagement through this very narrow message of a security framing: get rid of Huawei from the networks, without really providing a sensible alternative. And because of, I think, some previous policy decisions and this interplay between the technology and the national security and the economics around ZTE just a year or two prior, there was, at least in Europe, great skepticism over whether this was a push to promote American companies at the exclusion of Chinese companies in this kind of bilateral zero-sum way that is very distasteful to I think the European palate, if you will. And at the same time, there was criticism that, well, the US government is telling us to get rid of Huawei, but where's our alternative? They're not really providing a viable option. And so I think one of the things that's been helpful about the open and virtual network conversation is, on the one hand, it's sought to perhaps fill some of that void on the latter point about providing a viable alternative, at least perhaps in the medium term, if not tomorrow, though perhaps some of my colleagues might disagree on the timescales there. But I think it's also important to consider on the diplomatic level the effect that these conversations are having outside the United States, where there are certainly great markets for software and virtualized networks as well. And I think right now what we're seeing in Europe is this push for O-RAN and vRAN actually looks like the U.S. trying to insert itself to the disadvantage perhaps of European companies. And so, to your question, Melanie, about what's the path forward, I think absolutely we need to, double down on this innovation. But I would also extend this to doing it in a way that it brings in our allies and partners to to Senator Reid's comments, and perhaps that's about setting up pilot projects in coordination with some of our closer allies in Europe and Australia to build out some of these networks and military installations, and really give them sort of a piece of the pie of it as well, so that it's more about the U.S. plus its democratic allies advancing a democratic and open and interoperable alternative than it is necessarily about bilateral U.S. China disputes.
That's a really good point. One of the great things about broadening our 5G focus to include Chinese industrial policy, countering Chinese industrial policy, and supporting innovation is if we get that right, we can define those and pursue those goals in a way that other nations share and that other companies around the world share, so we could have a more inclusive approach to 5G. But it's a really good point you raised. We don't want to fall into the trap of doing, as a Japanese counterpart recently told me, doing America first, but just better. We do want to be inclusive and make sure that we are pursuing a broad and inclusive agenda. Thanks for raising that. So I invite the audience to start submitting your questions, and I see we're starting to get some. Before I move to audience questions, I welcome any of our panelists. Please start jumping in, do a two-finger or wave or whatever works for you. One question that we did get before the event is related to issues on how feasible it really is to deploy these vRAN networks in the near term. The first part of the question is in terms of speed. If we embrace these software virtualized solutions, is that going to significantly slow down the deployment of 5G in the United States or in other countries that choose that over the ready to go today Huawei approach? And then secondly, if you have one issue with interoperable systems that have a wide variety of vendors plugging in, who do you call when the phones don't work? So, if you're buying Huawei, if you're buying Samsung, if you're buying Nokia, if you're buying Ericsson, you know exactly who to call when you have a problem, and you know who's going to service your system. But if you've got a consortium of different players, that becomes more complicated. There's no one end-to-end provider. So John Baker, I saw you had your hand up, and others, please jump in after him to answer whatever parts of that you're interested in.
And I just sort of come back on a couple of points that Lindsay made there, just before getting to answer that question. When we talk about Open RAN, it's not necessarily a technology, it's a way of getting open and interoperable interfaces. And to that extent, this is sort of where the world needs to be. And this is one area where, if you can get governments all to say the same thing, that are producing open and interoperable interfaces, then, it's doing all economies good, and it's bringing new entrants into play. And to that extent, I've always said, Open RAN is all inclusive. It doesn't push anybody out. It just presents the opportunity for people to compete. And so, that really gives, the opportunity, and the fact that, you've got three very different companies here sort of in the same space, but doing things in a very different way to common interfaces demonstrates the fact that this can work, that, if you before Open RAN, there's 2 vendors now in the United States. Now you've got, including AutoStar, you've got 6 vendors that can go and compete in the marketplace. So, and that's just really come about because of the whole discussion on open interfaces. To the question, 5G in and virtualized RAN networks is really just starting to happen. We're right at the front end. I think, from a US perspective, US operators are on a different spending cycle, and there's a lot of investment going into place, on decisions that were made probably a year to 2 years ago. So, you'll see some virtual RAN deployments go into the US at some point in time. You're seeing it with Dish. Dish is a great example of building a, nationwide greenfield network with Open RAN suppliers, and it's doing it with, Mavenir and AutoStar and a number of other suppliers that are making that happen. So yes, 5G will happen. I don't believe any operator will let their 5G deployment slow down for a technology choice per se. They'll find a way to compete. and then the Open RAN solutions, if you like, will come through as the industry brings them into place. And then in terms of system integration, and you'll see other companies that will take end-to-end responsibility. Mavenir takes end-to-end responsibility for what we deploy, even though it's deploying other third-party components, and that's always a position. For the last 15 years, Mavenir has deployed open solutions based on software with third-party hardware, but we've always maintained responsibility for that. And so it's a great opportunity for new system integration companies to come to the fore and really put these networks into place going forward. So I think it's generating an opportunity, not necessarily a problem.
If I can add to that, there's a term of art in the technology industry called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Okay, so your comment about, are these things going to work together? It's going to be this big mess. This argument about the telephone network has been going on for a century. If you were to go back to the 1940s, there was a famous decision that the court ruled on called the Hushaphone. And this was our dominant network, Ma Bell at the time, right, which is really not reflective of the current companies because it's changed so much. But they blocked an entrepreneur that had a piece of plastic that went on the bottom of the handset to try to give you more confidentiality when you'd speak. It's kind of like cupping the handset. Literally, AT&T said you couldn't put it on our network because it would hurt our network. A piece of plastic on the end of the phone. The FCC actually supported them back in the day, right? And it created a big lawsuit. So this idea of creating fear around things are going to break, I mean, that process has been going on. It's just a new story, right? But what it took for MCI to get so you could plug in your own phone into the AT&T network. And this is just the latest saying, oh no, there's an interoperable interface. It's not going to work. The beauty of, actually, one of the beauties of the cell network is there are many cell sites. You get to experience a long tail of circumstances, right, with each deployment. And so you get to exercise those interfaces over a wide variety of ways and very quickly converge on things that truly are interoperable. That's what we're experiencing.
Yeah.
John, go ahead. Oh, sorry, John Mazzalingua.
Yeah, great comment, Steve. Your opening comment about the FUD that comes from the incumbents. I would just say on the standards that unless ORAN becomes a part of the 3GPP standard, the incumbents are going to block it. And remember that it's got to be adopted by 3GPP for it to be a standard. And ORAN itself does not specify virtualization. So I would say that Lindsay's comment around no one technology is going to solve this, and I agree. It's a one leg in the stool. It's necessary, but simply not enough. I think that you are starting to see, however, people and customers overcoming the FUD that Steve referenced. Because if you're going to build a 5G network from scratch today, you're going to do it in the manner that effectively ORAN is laying out for you, which is you're going to use piece parts. You're going to put and pit the best against each other in each of the component parts, and then you're going to make your decisions. And we see this in Japan. We see this in the U.S. and the DoD has incorporated this in its own RFPs, which just last week they've had announced 4 test beds for 5G experiments, and they've used 3 of the traditional RAN suppliers, and then they were specifically looking for the disruptor or the open system player, and we were fortunate to be involved in that as well. So this is just the beginning of what is going to happen here when you have these networks or a major government body like the DoD put their weight behind it. It's going to happen, and it's going to overcome a lot of the scare tactics that you might hear when you have a challenge to the incumbent players.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Yeah, I would just add quickly on that point. I think it's actually a really interesting opportunity for DoD to sort of take back some of this ability to drive private sector development. I think in the sort of technology and national security community, we've been worried for probably, I don't know, maybe the last 5 to 10 years that the Defense Department used to play this historic role in driving, and the US government more generally, in really incentivizing and driving technological development that the private sector has largely taken over. But I think, because the DoD has the ability to set up these pilot networks at individual military installations, throughout the country and also potentially throughout the world, accessing its global military operations, that there is actually a real, perhaps, a natural test bed that some of these pilot projects that this RFP that John just mentioned are able to get out. So I think there's a perhaps optimistic confluence of the national security and the technology possible if DoD leads some of these experimental initiatives, as it seems like it has started to.
So on that same point, we have two questions that just came up related to DoD and the dynamic spectrum sharing in the mid-band project. So we have two questions asking, does anyone have thoughts on a recent Pentagon initiative for dynamic spectrum sharing in the mid-band and building a DoD public-private 5G network that could compete with carriers? So how do you view that initiative? Is that helpful? Is that a game changer, Steve? It looks like you have a hand up.
Well, I think the DoD would be well served to frame it in terms of national security. So that infrastructure, so it's a highly politicized topic, right? You have incumbents that run their networks. You have the DoD wanting extra security. I mean, they're both valid perspectives. But what's undeniable is we have a national security issue. Things like PNT resilience, like the GPS denied problems and whatnot. We have a problem of drones flying around and we can't detect them. The DoD could deploy an infrastructure that solves those other problems at the same time. So it solves their comms, provides radar. Actually, 5G is radar technology. That's the core of 5G is called active.
Steve, I think the signal's mixing up a little bit. I can't hear you.
Spectrum sharing gone awry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so bandwidth sharing, yeah.
We'll give you a minute and loop back around. A related issue, we had a question about antitrust and anti-monopoly. We've been mentioning the monopoly, the oligopoly, the fact that there are a couple of big companies that have controlled dominant market share in the mobile network equipment market. I think John Baker mentioned that a lot of the American companies that are playing a role in this system, their only option has been to sell to one of those larger companies. So one of our audience members asked the question, does that mean we need an antitrust solution? Does this call for an anti-monopoly and antitrust? Do we need policy to break up that monopoly? That isn't how I understand what you all have been suggesting, but welcome you. I might have gotten it wrong and I'd really like to hear your thoughts on it. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we need to sort of be careful. I think, a lot of this has evolved because of the standards process has allowed this to happen. And the standards, if you like, you could argue have been manipulated to the extent that people can exploit them. So I think certainly there needs to be an overarching policy guidance, if you like, around standardization and product processes in these key areas. But I think the antitrust thing, maybe taking it a bit too far, because certainly I think it's come about because of the consolidation of the telecommunication industry. I think it's one of those things that got missed, if you like, when people were looking at these acquisitions and mergers of how interoperable various vendors' equipment was at the time. So I think we've arrived at a position because of many different changes going on in the world. But I certainly think the standardization issue should be really addressed in that sort of a way.
One way to look at it is there's a consolidated enough buyer community that they're exercising buyer power and pushing this, right? What in the past required antitrust action so you could plug in your own phone into the network as a consumer, right? The FCC and the courts had to get involved. The actual end customers, ORAN is operator driven, right? AT&T, for example, is a huge proponent of it. Verizon, Vodafone, Telefonica, all these operators. So thankfully, we shouldn't need antitrust involvement from that on that.
Yeah. If they put it into the buying process.
So John Mezzalingo and then Lindsay.
Well, I was going to say that that you really can't even begin to talk about, assuming that there was even a use of antitrust. I mean, if you, given the environment right now with big tech and all the talk about it and yet no action, I wouldn't have anyone hang their hopes on any trust. But it's way premature because there hasn't been. First thing that has to happen is for these companies like that are represented on the panel and hopefully others throughout the U.S. Begin to flourish, and then once there's legitimate alternatives, then you can perhaps have those conversations. But again, I wouldn't hang my head on it. But I think that puts the cart before the horse. I think we've got to focus on strengthening these companies that want and need to compete in the global sphere. And I think that the U.S. has held out the Chinese companies for the last 8 years, Huawei and ZTE. China is largely a bubble that you can't get into. So when you look at the rest of the world, that is what is the open ground here for the next U.S. player to become a multinational leader, much like the Swedish, the Finnish, and the South Korean companies. And if Huawei is not stopped through these policy recommendations that you've cited very clearly in your paper, Melanie, you won't have, and we won't have, the opportunity to have that kind of global player that we used to have. And that's to say nothing of the kind of communications that would originate in those countries where there are Chinese-based networks that want to communicate back to the U.S. You have those problems that are, I know, being discussed actively right now in the defense community. So I think it's a broader question about giving the life and the energy and the shot in the arm to the companies here in the U.S. that can play that role.
Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I have sort of less to say on the antitrust perspective, other than that I think it seems like this industry is more ripe for disruption than some that have currently, been the subject of antitrust investigations in the more sort of less solid information space and around data. But I would like to pick up on the question about dynamic spectrum sharing and DoD's recent RFI, because I do actually think that this is an important part of U.S. competitiveness and interoperability with global systems that we do need to be taking some steps towards. And really what I think the Defense Innovation Board found about a year and a half ago was that right now the Pentagon is sitting on much of sort of the Goldilocks spectrum at which 5G can operate, and in where China has really doubled down on their 5G deployments, and that's the mid-band spectrum. And right now it's being used primarily with radar systems, airborne and ground-based, and those are, certainly, important critical military operations. But it's meant that we in the United States have had to take a different tack on 5G. Namely prioritizing millimeter wave deployments that have had some technical hurdles in the rollout, but perhaps are the future in faster and small cell deployments, particularly in large urban areas. But what I think there's potentially a possibility of opening up some of this mid-band spectrum, and that's where this kind of dynamic spectrum sharing or just general spectrum sharing really could come into play, whereby the DoD would actually share parts of that spectrum that it uses for these radar systems and other satellite systems, et cetera, and share that with either commercial 5G networks or a DoD 5G network that operated in the mid-band range to take advantage not only of the quality of the bands in terms of their perspectives or possibilities for high throughput and low latency applications, but also some of the other components around the spectra that are being developed for example, the Chinese deployments, and sort of speed up that process. So I do think that's something worth keeping an eye on in terms of how do we get to 5G faster and make sure that we do it obviously in a secure way, but but we are able to incentivize some of this application rollout by actually having the fast speeds that we need to, so that China doesn't corner the market on the applications, these data-driven applications that sit at top 5G, because US deployments are really right now, not much better than 4G itself.
Thank you. Another topic that we should make sure to cover is supply chain security. So Senator Reid mentioned that himself, the Senate Armed Services Committee, and others across the U.S. Congress are really thinking about this question of where do our hardware and software components come from? Where does the hardware come from? Where is the software coding done? And are there pieces of the supply chain that we need to really think critically about where they are made? As we talk about this shift to virtualized RAN, virtualized software-based 5G networks, we do still need some hardware components. John Mezzalingua described a server that could be from anywhere. We also do need some radios. We do need some antennas. And a lot of that is still made in China, as I understand. So I would be great to hear your thoughts on, as there are many moving pieces that we need to get right. And one of it is making sure that we have not just the right companies, not just the trusted companies, but also our equipment and our software. We know where it's coming from, and we know that we have a secure supply chain. So what are some things that are happening, might need to happen in future to make sure that we have that piece of the puzzle right?
I think a lot of it is picking targeted innovation. I'm on the board of a company that does 3D metal printing, for example, which is going to return a lot of manufacturing back to the U.S. It replaces, millions of CNC machines that China has deployed, for example. Okay, there are similar lenses with which to look at the 5G supply chain and where DoD innovation can drive high-tech solutions that can be made in the U.S. that nullifies, China's present advantages in the sector.
And John Baker, did you have your hand up as well? We can't hear you. I think you're still on mute. No, why don't we go to John Mezzalingua first and then over to John Baker?
Yeah, I think that there's an opportunity to have the type of government opportunity or the type of regulations that are out there. I'm sorry, the incentives that are out there that will bolster our industry, I think are there. I think one of the issues that we have to be thinking about is when they are applied, because none of them are that novel. There's grants, there's subsidies, there's support for buyers, there's potentially mandates for customers to use technology sourced from a particular area and region. So let's say the U.S. I think the big key is going to be making sure that the devil is in the details as to where the product actually originates, because you can have a product that originates from one location, but all of the subcomponents might come from places that we may not be comfortable where they come from. And I think the risk here is that this has such national attention, the issue of 5G, not just as a technology that we can be left behind, but more as a matter of national security. There's going to be a lot of money thrown at this, whether it's a Republican or Democratic administration. This seems to be the one of two, let's say, bipartisan issues that actually exists right now in our country. The question is, with all the money that's going to be ultimately splashed, whichever the form it takes, it really must be really tightly defined as to, in order to achieve our objectives, so you don't have extraordinary leakage, because everyone's going to have their hand out, and the worst of all worlds is that you don't actually achieve the goal, because what may appear as a U.S. entity may not have true U.S. content or U.S. source, whether it's the manufacturing side or other elements as to where the code is written, how it's protected, that's non-U.S. So that to me is where the big issue is. The other elements and the remedies are well used in other industries that whether it's renewable energy or others. There's clear stimulants out there that can be used. The question is how.
And John Baker, is your microphone working now? We can't hear you yet, but we have hope. Not working just yet. All right. We have a question from DoD actually. Hang on, let me see. So should industry, so we have a question from someone who's part of the 5G initiative and the test sites that we've been discussing here. So to that person, thank you for that initiative. That's great. And their question is, should industry and government, for example, DoD, be developing their own 5G infrastructure, leveraging commercial 5G deployment or pursuing some hybrid? Does anybody want to try that one? Steve?
I mean, to me, this is similar to the other question, which is about the announcement about building such a network. There are ambitious things that only the DoD could pursue that there aren't commercial motivations to pursue. If they have a vision to do that, then it completely makes sense. If it's just about data security, unless there's some ambitious extension of the standard that they're contemplating, I'm not as encouraged by the idea. But if they have differentiated vision that they can uniquely invest in, that's why I raise things like the implementation of radar in the infrastructure, resilient PNT. These are things that would not normally be solved by a commercial infrastructure provider. So if they have those ambitions, then great, let's do it.
Great.
Yeah.
So we only have about 5 minutes left, and I want to give each of you the opportunity to share some closing thoughts, any points that you weren't able to get in. Before we do, I would mention we did have one audience member who asked, when will the rural parts of America get 5G? So if I could ask you, as you formulate your closing thoughts, we also want to make sure that the cool, innovative solutions that the U.S. is generating are reaching across all of America. And so when should we expect 5G, not just in New York City and DC, but in rural areas? And is there a way that vRAN could have some particular utility in making that happen faster, since it doesn't require as much equipment? And John Baker, I'll go to you first. And then
let's try it.
maybe Baker, Steve, Mezzalingua, and Lindsay Gorman in that order. I can hear you this time. Go ahead.
Good. So I'll just catch up. So on the question about supply chain, so RF manufacturing should be brought back to the US. 10 years ago, the US was rich with RF manufacturing, and or suddenly got moved to China, and to the extent of Mavenir and Altiostar as competitors, we're working together to bring radio supplies back to the US. Of US sourcing for the essentially the swap of the Huawei equipment in the rural markets. The rural tier 2, tier 3 carriers have a great opportunity under this rip and replace to get Open RAN solutions into their networks, and both supporting both 4G and 5G. So very much encouraging Open RAN solutions as this rip and replace goes forward next year in real terms. So great opportunity to bring those networks up to speed and have in some respects, have better technology than the tier 1 providers have, and to that extent for them to be able to compete. So anyway, thanks for the opportunity. Sorry about the microphones.
Steve, over to you.
Sure. O-RAN not only can address a lot of the security issues, but if O-RAN is going to be successful globally, it has to offer better economics in terms of deployment. That is the same problem as rural networks. In fact, 5G and rural are the same problem, serving ever fewer users with the same equipment, okay? Today, we are deploying with Inland Cellular in the Pacific Northwest, right, an O-RAN network that is allowing them to add hundreds of sites to their network. So they're in a very rural place. Previously, their budget was going to allow them to afford an upgrade of their incumbent equipment. What we enable them to do is double the size of their network at the same time by improving the economics. That's the power of O-RAN. So this whole question about rural, O-RAN holds the key to unlocking rural by bringing better economics, right? Better interoperability is going to create more choices. As you said it yourself, what you might need for a rural network is different than what you need for downtown Manhattan. And if an oligopoly doesn't have the incentives to build that equipment, ORAN makes it possible for anyone to do it.
Thank you. John Mezzalingua.
Yeah, my closing comment would not be around a need for or concern around anything relating to technology or U.S. companies coming up with bright and creative ways to solve the problem. Since there is clear momentum to have legislation on both sides of the aisle to get this thing underway and to start to recapture our lead, my closing thought really is around the nature of the legislation, and at the highest level, I would say that again, the basket of incentives and that can be sorted out because it's been leveraged in other industries and other segments and to a decent amount of success, I would say. What I would say is it has to be comprehensive, and it has to encompass each of the legs of the stool that Lindsay, you mentioned, and that many have discussed here, and Melanie, you have it in your paper that it's all listed there, the various approaches, and it's got to be consistent. Remember that we're looking at, as you rightly cited throughout your paper, 20 years of consistent, sophisticated, predatory industrial policy by the Chinese. So we have to be able to stick with it for a long period of time. It can't be in 1 year and then lose its flavor in a following year, because it's a long game of catch up, and we can do it effectively, but we've got to just make sure that the policy side keeps that in mind.
Thank you. And Lindsay, we'll give you the last word.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I guess I'll just close out by doubling down on the multilateral approach that I think Senator Reid introduced into this discussion. Particularly when we're thinking about these things from a national security angle, competitiveness and innovation and national security are interacting in weird ways, given the way that China uses these state subsidies and these coercive market practices and intellectual property theft to gain an advantage. And I think, the flip side of that is the way that China weaponizes its economy to shape discourse, to shape opinions about China, to shape opinions about Chinese technology. And that's something that the 5G and actually the 6G conversation especially is not at all immune to, particularly in some of these standards bodies. And in the rollout of next generation technology. So I think that multilateral approach is really important. And to kind of your earlier question about sort of the supply chain, and I think there's been significant debate and wondering really about this decoupling that's potentially on the horizon and maybe has in fact already started. How far do we go? And I think that's another area where however far we go, we really need to do that with our allies, not only for our international credibility, but also for the competitiveness of U.S. companies, which could be hamstrung in ways if the United States takes action to block certain suppliers, but some of our allies and partners do not, and around export control and the like. So yeah, I would close out by saying that we are in this fight sort of as democracies, and some of the U.S. versus China framing is helpful from the perspective of spurring innovation, but I would say to recast it slightly in a frame of democracies versus autocracies, and to make sure that our technology really does reflect our values, because I think that's really the core of the problem. Between this issue with China, it's not that it's the world's second largest economy; it's that it's the world's second largest economy in a way that is extremely authoritarian and committing grave human rights abuses. So I would say, yeah, we should not lose focus on the real contest at stake as we pursue these numerous solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate you joining us, and I appreciate the conversation. For folks who want to dig deeper into this, the Center for American Progress published a report today called "There is a Solution to the Huawei Challenge." That's on our website. and it dives into some of the issues we've been talking about here today. So many thanks to John Baker, to Lindsay Gorman, to John Mezzalingua, and to Steve Papa for helping us talk through what the solution looks like and identify how this is actually a great opportunity for the US to get the policy side right and to really unlock some long-standing market barriers, make the market more diverse, and really open doors for American innovation. So thanks to you all for what you're doing in this sphere. Your work makes me optimistic, and that's something I and many others need these days. So thank you again. We appreciate you joining us, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.